June 19th, 1944. 0745 hours. 150 miles west of the Mariana Islands. Lieutenant Commander Zenji Abe stood in the ready room of the aircraft carrier Zuikaku, briefing pilots for the morning strike. Behind him, a blackboard showed the expected American force composition: 4 carriers, perhaps 5. Intelligence estimates suggested the Americans could deploy approximately 300 aircraft total. Abe's strike force consisted of 69 aircraft. Behind them, 3 more waves were being prepared. Over 400 aircraft would hit the American carriers in coordinated strikes throughout the day. The numbers seemed adequate. 4 waves of over 100 aircraft each against an enemy force of 300 would overwhelm American defenses through sheer volume. Japanese naval doctrine had always emphasized the massed strike: throw everything at the enemy, accept losses, sink carriers. What Lieutenant Commander Abe did not know, what Japanese naval intelligence had failed to comprehend, was that the American force waiting over the horizon was not 4 carriers with 300 aircraft. It was 15 carriers with 956 aircraft, more than double Japanese estimates. The intelligence failure was not about counting ships. Reconnaissance aircraft had photographed American task forces. Naval intelligence knew American carriers were larger than Japanese carriers. They had the displacement figures. USS Essex, 27,100 tons standard displacement. Zuikaku, 25,600 tons. The American ships were slightly larger, but not dramatically so. The critical miscalculation was aircraft capacity. Japanese fleet carriers in 1944 operated between 63 and 75 aircraft, depending on the specific ship and mission profile. Intelligence officers analyzing American carrier capabilities assumed similar numbers. A carrier displacing 27,000 tons should logically operate 70 to 80 aircraft, perhaps 85 aircraft under crowded conditions, but Essex-class carriers were routinely operating with 100 aircraft embarked. Some carried as many as 108 aircraft during specific operations. This was not an incremental advantage. This was not 10% more aircraft or 20% more aircraft. This was 40 to 50% more combat power packed into a hull only marginally larger than Japanese designs. The disparity violated every assumption Japanese naval architects had made about carrier design constraints. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The revelation would come gradually, painfully, through combat reports that made no tactical sense. Strike leaders returning from missions against American task forces reported carrier groups defending themselves with aircraft numbers that seemed impossible. Fighter directors described coordinated defense by 50, 60, even 70 fighters, simultaneously airborne from what appeared to be a single task group of 3 or 4 carriers. The numbers did not add up. Japanese carrier doctrine held that a fleet carrier could launch and recover approximately 75% of its total aircraft complement in a single operation. The remaining 25% remained aboard for combat air patrol, reserve, or maintenance. A 4-carrier task force, operating 70 aircraft per carrier, should field a total of 280 aircraft, with approximately 210 available for strike or defense at any given moment. American task forces were routinely putting 300 to 400 aircraft into the air from what Japanese reconnaissance identified as 4 or 5 carrier formations. Either American carriers operated at impossibly high sortie rates, or they carried far more aircraft than Japanese intelligence believed possible. The truth was both. Essex-class carriers did carry more aircraft, and they operated them more efficiently. But the primary factor was raw capacity. 100 aircraft per carrier, instead of 70, meant 40% more striking power from the same number of hulls. The story of how American carrier designers achieved this capacity advantage begins not with brilliant innovation, but with fundamental design philosophy. Japanese carriers were built around operational doctrine that emphasized quality over quantity. American carriers were built around industrial doctrine that emphasized quantity over elegance. The difference shaped every aspect of carrier design and ultimately determined which philosophy would dominate the Pacific War. Japanese carrier design in the late 1930s and early 1940s followed principles established over 2 decades of carrier development. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku each represented refinement of previous designs. Each incorporated lessons from operational experience. The design philosophy prioritized speed, protection, and strike capability in balanced proportion. Shokaku-class carriers, the most advanced Japanese carriers in service when war began, displaced 25,600 tons standard and could make 34 knots. They carried 8-inch armor belts, armored flight decks, and comprehensive anti-aircraft batteries. Their aircraft capacity was 72 aircraft under normal conditions, expandable to 84 aircraft under wartime loading. That capacity reflected careful calculation of hangar space, flight deck operations, maintenance requirements, and crew accommodations. Japanese naval architects understood that carrier efficiency depended on more than just stuffing maximum aircraft into available space. Aircraft needed maintenance. Maintenance required shop space, spare parts storage, and trained mechanics. Flight operations required deck crews, refueling stations, arming areas, and coordination spaces. Pilots needed ready rooms, briefing facilities, and rest areas between missions. The Shokaku-class design allocated space for all these functions with careful attention to operational flow. Maintenance shops were positioned near hangar elevators for efficient aircraft movement. Fuel storage was distributed to minimize vulnerability to single hits. Ammunition magazines were protected deep in the hull. Every design decision balanced competing requirements. More aircraft capacity meant less fuel storage or less armor or less crew accommodation. Japanese designers sought optimal balance rather than maximum numbers. This philosophy produced carriers that were genuinely excellent ships. Shokaku and Zuikaku served throughout the war, participating in every major carrier engagement from Pearl Harbor to the Philippine Sea. They were tough, resilient, capable platforms that could absorb tremendous damage and continue operating. But they carried 72 aircraft in normal configuration. American Essex-class carriers carried 100. The American design philosophy was fundamentally different. When the United States Navy began planning the Essex-class in 1939, the primary design requirement was not balance or elegance. It was maximum strike power within treaty-limited displacement of 27,000 tons. Naval architects were told to pack as many aircraft as physically possible into that tonnage limit. Everything else was secondary. This created a design problem. How do you fit 30% more aircraft into a hull, only 5% larger than Japanese equivalents? The answer required rethinking every aspect of carrier design. American designers started with the hangar deck. Japanese carriers used closed hangars, fully enclosed spaces with armored overhead protection. The armor provided protection against bombs and shellfire, but it also added weight and limited hangar height. Essex-class carriers used open hangar designs with minimal overhead protection. The hangar deck was essentially a large covered space with roll-up doors on the sides for ventilation and aircraft movement. This saved thousands of tons of topside weight that could be allocated to aircraft capacity and aviation fuel storage. The lack of armored hangar decks was controversial. Critics argued it left the ships vulnerable to bomb hits that penetrated the wooden flight deck. Supporters argued that American damage control procedures and redundant systems would compensate for reduced passive protection. The debate would be settled by combat experience, but the immediate benefit was clear. Open hangars allowed taller hangar clearance, which enabled stacking of more aircraft through more efficient arrangement. They also reduced topside weight, which improved stability and allowed more weight to be allocated to aviation systems. The flight deck design was equally radical. Japanese carriers used relatively narrow flight decks, typically 85 to 90 feet wide at the hangar level, flaring to 95 to 100 feet at the bow. This provided adequate deck space for operations while minimizing the topside weight that affected stability. Essex-class carriers had flight decks 108 feet wide at the hangar level, extending 147 feet at the bow. The wider deck allowed more aircraft to be spotted on deck simultaneously. This was critical because carrier strike operations depended on rapid launch of large formations. A wider deck meant more aircraft could be positioned for immediate launch without requiring complex shuffling. Japanese carriers typically spotted 18 to 24 aircraft on deck for a maximum effort launch. Essex-class carriers could spot 36 to 45 aircraft on deck, enabling them to launch massive strikes without delay. The hangar design itself reflected different operational philosophies. Japanese hangars were divided into sections by fire curtains and blast doors, which limited fire spread but created bottlenecks for aircraft movement. American hangars were largely open spaces with minimal internal subdivision. This enabled rapid aircraft movement between hangar and flight deck using 3 elevators positioned for maximum operational flow. Essex-class elevators were larger than those on Japanese carriers, measuring 60 feet by 34 feet, compared to typical Japanese elevator dimensions of 42 feet by 39 feet. The larger elevators could handle aircraft with wings folded or spread, reducing the time required for elevator cycles. More importantly, the 3-elevator arrangement allowed simultaneous movement of aircraft from hangar to flight deck at multiple positions. Japanese carriers typically used 2 elevators, one centerline, one deck edge, or offset. This created operational bottlenecks during maximum effort launches, when dozens of aircraft needed to be brought topside quickly. The 3rd elevator on Essex-class carriers eliminated most bottlenecks and enabled sustained high-tempo operations. Aviation fuel storage reflected American emphasis on sustained operations. Essex-class carriers carried 240,000 gallons of aviation gasoline compared to approximately 150,000 gallons on Zuikaku-class carriers. This gave Essex-class carriers endurance for extended operations without refueling. A carrier embarking 100 aircraft, each requiring an average of 200 gallons per sortie, could sustain 12 full, deck-load strikes before requiring replenishment. Japanese carriers with 72 aircraft and 150,000 gallons of fuel could sustain 10 full strikes. The difference seems minor until you consider continuous operations over multiple days. American carriers could operate at high tempo longer before requiring logistical support. In a campaign involving multiple carrier task forces operating hundreds of miles from bases, this endurance advantage compounded across the fleet. Ordnance storage followed the same philosophy. American carriers carried larger bomb and torpedo magazines, more ammunition for aircraft guns, more pyrotechnics for marking targets. Everything was sized for sustained high-intensity operations rather than single decisive strikes. The design philosophy extended to crew accommodations. Essex-class carriers had larger crews than Japanese equivalents. USS Essex commissioned with a crew of approximately 2,600 men compared to Zuikaku's 1,660 men. The difference reflected American emphasis on redundancy and specialization. American carriers carried more mechanics per aircraft, more ordnancemen per bomb, more deck crew per operation. This enabled higher sortie rates because maintenance could be performed continuously by specialized crews rather than by multi-role sailors working serial tasks. Japanese carrier crews were highly trained professionals who could perform multiple functions. American carrier crews were specialists trained for narrow roles but available in sufficient numbers to maintain parallel operations. The American approach required more men, more berthing space, more mess facilities, more everything, but it enabled operational tempo that Japanese carriers with their smaller, multi-skilled crews could not match. The aircraft themselves were designed around different philosophies that affected carrier operations. Japanese naval aircraft emphasized range and performance. The Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter could fly over 1,600 miles, enabling strikes deep into enemy territory and extended combat air patrol coverage. But achieving that range required lightweight construction, no armor, minimal protection, fragile fuel systems. American naval aircraft emphasized survivability and firepower. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter had range of approximately 1,000 miles, adequate for fleet operations, but significantly less than the Zero. However, the Hellcat featured armor protection for the pilot, self-sealing fuel tanks, and heavy armament. It was designed to absorb damage and return to the carrier. The design philosophy reflected American industrial strength. If a pilot survived being shot down, he could be rescued and returned to duty, flying a replacement aircraft. America had sufficient industrial capacity to prioritize pilot survival over maximum aircraft range. Japan could not afford that luxury. Every pilot lost represented years of irreplaceable training. Japanese doctrine emphasized aircraft performance to keep pilots alive through superior combat capability. American doctrine emphasized protection to keep pilots alive when combat capability proved insufficient. The carrier aircraft capacity calculation was affected by aircraft size and weight. Larger, heavier aircraft required more hangar space, stronger elevator, and more robust deck structure. The Hellcat was heavier than the Zero, approximately 9,200 pounds empty, compared to the Zero's 3,700 pounds empty weight. Essex-class carriers were designed from initial concept to operate these heavier aircraft in large numbers. Structural strength, elevator capacity, hangar clearance, everything was sized for American aircraft, rather than being adapted from designs optimized for lighter Japanese types. This meant Essex-class carriers could operate 100 Hellcats, while Japanese carriers struggled to operate 72 Zeros, despite the Zero being much lighter per aircraft. The difference came down to systematic design for high-density operations versus refined design for balanced performance. By mid-1943, the first Essex-class carriers were entering combat in the Pacific. USS Essex, Yorktown, Lexington, and Bunker Hill formed the core of Task Force 15 during strikes on Marcus Island in September 1943. Each carrier deployed with approximately 90 aircraft, nearly 30% more than Japanese intelligence estimates suggested was possible for American fleet carriers. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft photographed these task forces. The images showed 4 carriers, with numerous aircraft visible on flight decks. Intelligence officers counted the visible aircraft, estimated reserves in hangars based on Japanese carrier norms, and concluded the American force fielded approximately 280 to 300 aircraft. The actual number was closer to 360 aircraft. The 20% intelligence error would have catastrophic consequences when Japanese forces encountered American carrier groups expecting one level of opposition and facing another. The intelligence failure stemmed from reasonable assumptions applied to unreasonable designs. If Japanese carriers of similar size carried 70 aircraft, American carriers should carry similar numbers. No one in Japanese naval intelligence conceived that American designers had simply crammed 40% more aircraft into similar hulls by accepting compromises Japanese designers refused. The open hangar design that saved topside weight, the minimal internal subdivision that enabled rapid aircraft movement, the 3-elevator arrangement that eliminated operational bottlenecks, the massive fuel and ordnance storage that enabled sustained operations. Every design decision prioritized aircraft capacity and operational tempo over protection, elegance, or balanced performance. The result was carriers that violated Japanese assumptions about what was physically possible. Admiral Mark Mitcher, who commanded Fast Carrier Task Force 58 during the Central Pacific Campaign, understood the implications of numerical superiority. In January 1944, he wrote to Admiral Chester Nimitz, explaining his operational concept. The key to carrier supremacy was not sophisticated tactics or brilliant maneuvers. It was simple mathematics. More aircraft meant more strikes, better defense, higher attrition of enemy forces, and inevitable victory through cumulative advantage. Mitcher's task force in June 1944 consisted of 15 carriers. 7 Essex-class fleet carriers, 8 Independence-class light carriers. The fleet carriers each embarked approximately 100 aircraft. The light carriers embarked 33 to 35 aircraft each. Total air group strength, approximately 950 aircraft. Japanese mobile fleet under Admiral Ozawa consisted of 9 carriers, 3 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers. The fleet carriers embarked 70 to 75 aircraft each. The light carriers embarked 27 to 30 aircraft each. Total air group strength, approximately 450 aircraft. The American advantage was better than 2-to-1 in raw numbers. But the advantage extended beyond simple aircraft count. American carriers could surge higher sortie rates through their larger fuel and ordnance storage, enabling sustained operations that exhausted Japanese capacity to respond. American carriers could maintain stronger combat air patrols through higher aircraft density, creating layered defenses that Japanese strikes could not penetrate. The Battle of the Philippine Sea would expose every assumption Japanese naval intelligence had made about American carrier capabilities. At 0730 hours on June 19, 1944, Admiral Ozawa launched his first strike wave from a position 300 miles west of the American task force. 69 aircraft departed their carriers, climbing to attack altitude as they formed up over the fleet. The strike composition reflected Japanese carrier doctrine refined over 3 years of war. 45 Yokosuka WWII Judy dive bombers, 16 Nakajima Baikushi N JIL torpedo bombers, and 8 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters for escort. The ratio of bombers to fighters, nearly 6-to-1, demonstrated Japanese confidence that their strike aircraft could penetrate American defenses through speed, altitude, and tactical coordination. Ozawa believed he held a significant advantage. His aircraft had longer range than American carrier aircraft. He could strike from distances where American carriers could not retaliate. His plan was to launch multiple strikes throughout the day, overwhelming American defenses through sustained pressure while remaining outside American strike range. The plan was sound. It was based on accurate information about aircraft performance and reasonable assumptions about American carrier capabilities. What Ozawa did not know was that American radar had detected his strike wave while it was still forming up over Japanese carriers, 150 miles from American ships. Fighter directors aboard American carriers watched the formation on radar, the screens, tracking its approach, calculating its speed and heading, and vectoring fighters to intercept positions 70 miles from the fleet. This gave American Combat Air Patrol time to climb to altitude, position for optimal attack angles, and coordinate a defense that would hit the Japanese formation in waves. The first wave of American fighters, 40 F-6F Hellcats from Essex and Hornet, intercepted the Japanese strike at 0940 hours. The Japanese formation was still 40 miles from the American carriers, flying at 18,000 feet in tight formation. The Hellcats attacked from above and behind, diving through the Japanese formation with altitude and speed advantage. In the first pass, they shot down 25 aircraft. The Japanese formation disintegrated. Dive bombers broke formation, attempting to evade. Torpedo bombers descended to wave-top altitude, where their slower speed made them vulnerable. Zero escorts turned to engage the Hellcats, but were overwhelmed by numbers and superior aircraft. Performance. A second wave of American fighters, 30 Hellcats from Lexington and Bunker Hill, hit the scattered Japanese formation at 0945 hours. They shot down another 17 aircraft. The surviving Japanese aircraft, now numbering only 27 from the original 69, continued toward the American task force. They encountered a third wave of fighters at 1,000 hours, then anti-aircraft fire from screening destroyers and cruisers. By the time the strike reached attack range of American carriers, only 8 aircraft remained combat effective. They attempted to press attacks against the carriers, but were driven off by concentrated anti-aircraft fire and persistent fighter attacks. 4 aircraft dropped bombs that missed. 0 aircraft scored hits. 4 aircraft returned to their carriers. The first strike wave lost 94% of its aircraft without achieving a single hit on American ships. Strike leaders who survived radioed confused reports back to Ozawa's flagship. They described being intercepted by fighters before reaching attack range. They reported encountering fighters in waves, with new formations appearing whenever they thought they had cleared defenses. They described American fighters appearing at optimal intercept positions, as though the Americans knew exactly where the strike would be and when it would arrive. Ozawa received these reports and drew the only conclusion that seemed logical. American combat air patrol coverage was far stronger than intelligence estimates suggested. Either American carriers were operating at unsustainable sortie rates, or they had far more aircraft than Japanese reconnaissance had identified. He ordered the second strike wave to launch anyway. The plan required sustained pressure. Even heavy losses were acceptable if Japanese strikes eventually overwhelmed American defenses and sank carriers. The second wave launched at 0856 hours, 109 aircraft, 53 Judy dive bombers, 27 Jill torpedo bombers, 48, 0 fighters. This time Ozawa allocated more fighters for escort, recognizing that American combat air patrol was stronger than anticipated. The strike formed up and proceeded toward the American task force at 18,000 feet. American radar detected them at 1,020 hours, while they were still 130 miles away. Fighter directors scrambled every available Hellcat, pulling aircraft from combat air patrol stations, launching ready-deck aircraft, even recalling fighters returning from the first engagement and redirecting them to intercept the new threat. The second Japanese strike was larger than the first. The American response was proportionally larger. 70 Hellcats intercepted the formation at 1,050 hours, 50 miles from the carriers. The engagement was not a battle. It was systematic destruction. American fighters attacked in coordinated waves, each wave hitting from different angles, breaking up the Japanese formation, isolating individual aircraft for methodical elimination. Japanese pilots who had trained for 6 months were facing American pilots with 200 hours of combat experience, flying superior aircraft with radar direction, providing perfect situational awareness. The outcome was predetermined. 97 Japanese aircraft were shot down. 12 aircraft reached attack range. 6 managed to drop bombs or torpedoes. 1 bomb hit the battleship South Dakota, causing minor damage. 11 aircraft returned to their carriers. The second strike lost 89% of its aircraft for a single bomb hit that caused no significant operational impact. Ozawa launched a third strike at 1,000 hours, 47 aircraft. They became disoriented during the approach, scattered by weather and persistent fighter attacks. Some aircraft found the American task force, but were driven off without pressing attacks. Others never located the enemy and returned with ordnance still aboard. 20 aircraft were lost, 0 hits were achieved. The fourth strike launched at 1,130 hours with 82 aircraft. This strike encountered the same layered defense: radar detection at extreme range, fighter direction to optimal intercept positions, coordinated attacks by fighters in overwhelming numbers. 73 aircraft were shot down. The 9 survivors fled without attempting attacks. By 1400 hours, Ozawa had launched 430 aircraft in 4 waves. He had lost 300 aircraft in combat. Another 50 would crash attempting to land on carriers in darkness after the battle, bringing total aircraft losses to 350. American combat losses were 29 aircraft, mostly to operational accidents rather than enemy action. The exchange ratio was 12-1 in America's favor. But the numbers that shocked Japanese observers were not just the losses, it was the scale of American defense. Japanese strike leaders reported encountering 50, 60, even 70 fighters simultaneously. This made no sense. American task force consisted of approximately 15 carriers based on reconnaissance reports. If American carriers operated 70 aircraft each like Japanese carriers, 15 carriers should field 1,050 total aircraft with perhaps 700 available for combat operations at any given time. Allocating 1/3 of available aircraft to combat air patrol would provide approximately 230 fighters for defense. But Japanese strikes were encountering fighter strength that suggested American carriers were keeping nearly half their total aircraft strength airborne for defense. Either American sortie rates exceeded anything Japanese doctrine considered sustainable, or American carriers carried far more aircraft than 70 per ship. Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, operations officer on the carrier Zuikaku, was tasked with analyzing the engagement results. He collected strike reports from surviving pilots and coordinated with intelligence officers to reconcile pilot observations with known American force composition. The analysis revealed a disturbing pattern. American fighter defenses consistently appeared in greater strength than Japanese doctrine predicted was possible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Strike leaders reported encountering 3 distinct waves of fighters during approaches to the target. First wave at 40 to 50 miles from carriers, second wave at 20 to 30 miles, third wave at 5 to 10 miles, plus anti-aircraft fire from screening ships. Each wave consisted of 20 to 40 fighters. Simple arithmetic suggested American carriers were maintaining 60 to 120 fighters continuously airborne for combat air patrol. 15 American carriers operating 70 aircraft, each would field 1,050 total aircraft. Maintaining 120 fighters on combat air patrol simultaneously would require cycling approximately 250 fighters through patrol stations to account for fuel limitations and relief rotations. That would represent nearly 25% of total American air group, strength dedicated permanently to defense. It was possible, but it was not sustainable over multiple days of operations. Yet American carriers had been operating at high tempo for weeks during the approach to the Marianas. They had launched strikes against land targets, maintained continuous combat air patrol, and still possessed sufficient aircraft strength to destroy Japanese carrier strikes with overwhelming force. Okumiya's analysis concluded that American carriers must be operating with significantly higher aircraft capacity than Japanese intelligence estimates. He calculated that American fleet carriers were likely embarking 90 to 100 aircraft rather than 70. His report was submitted to Fleet Command with a recommendation that all future operational planning assume American carriers operated with 40% more aircraft than previously estimated. The report was received with skepticism. Naval staff officers questioned whether Okumiya's estimates were inflated by combat stress among surviving pilots who might have overestimated enemy strength during chaotic engagements. The idea that American carriers could operate 100 aircraft seemed to violate basic principles of naval architecture. A carrier displacing 27,000 tons could not physically accommodate 100 aircraft plus fuel, ordnance, crew, and systems without compromising seaworthiness or operational capability. Yet the combat results spoke clearly. American carriers were fielding aircraft strength that was inconsistent with 70 aircraft per carrier. Either American carriers were larger than reconnaissance suggested, or they were achieving aircraft density that Japanese designers believed impossible, or American operational doctrine enabled sortie rates that exceeded Japanese understanding of carrier limitations. The truth was all 3 factors contributed, but the primary factor was simple aircraft capacity. Essex-class carriers routinely operated with 100 aircraft embarked. This was not emergency overloading or temporary surge capacity. It was standard operational configuration. American carrier designers had prioritized aircraft capacity above all other considerations, accepting compromises in protection, elegance, and balanced performance to pack maximum strike power into treaty-limited displacement. The design philosophy reflected American industrial strength and strategic thinking. More aircraft per carrier meant fewer carriers needed for equivalent combat power. It also meant each carrier represented a more valuable target, but American industrial capacity could replace losses faster than Japan could sink carriers, so the risk was acceptable. Japanese design philosophy had prioritized balanced performance and survivability. A well-protected carrier that survived multiple engagements provided more value over time than a high-capacity carrier that might be sunk in its first battle. This thinking made sense when carriers were rare and irreplaceable. It made no sense when the enemy could build carriers faster than you could sink them. By June 1944, American shipyards had commissioned 17 Essex-class carriers with more under construction. Japan had commissioned one fleet carrier, Taiho, since the war began. The industrial disparity was so severe that Japanese carrier design philosophy, however sound in principle, was irrelevant in practice. It did not matter if Japanese carriers were better protected when America had 10 carriers for every Japanese carrier. The arithmetic of attrition favored the side with more hulls, more aircraft, more pilots, and more industrial capacity to replace losses. The revelation of American carrier aircraft capacity came gradually through accumulated intelligence reports, prisoner interrogations, and captured documents. In August 1944, American forces captured Tinian Island in the Marianas. Japanese naval personnel evacuating the island left behind technical manuals and operational documents that fell into American hands and were subsequently analyzed by intelligence officers. Among these documents were recognition manuals describing American carrier classes with technical specifications. The manuals had been prepared by Japanese naval intelligence for distribution to fleet units to aid in target identification during combat operations. The specifications listed Essex-class carrier aircraft capacity as 90 to 100 aircraft in standard configuration. Japanese intelligence had known the correct numbers since at least early 1944. The information had been distributed to fleet commands, but operational planning continued to assume American carriers operated 70 aircraft because planners did not believe the intelligence estimates. The cognitive dissonance was understandable. For decades, Japanese naval architects had established that a carrier displacing 27,000 tons could optimally operate 70 to 75 aircraft. This figure balanced hangar capacity, flight deck operations, fuel and ordnance storage, maintenance requirements, and crew accommodations. Attempting to operate 100 aircraft from such a hull would require unacceptable compromises. Reduced fuel storage would limit operational radius. Reduced ordnance storage would limit sustained operations. Inadequate maintenance space would reduce aircraft availability. Insufficient crew accommodations would degrade effectiveness. The math was clear. 100 aircraft on a 27,000-ton carrier was theoretically possible, but operationally foolish. Except the Americans were doing it, and they were doing it successfully. Essex-class carriers were sustaining high sortie rates for weeks at a time. They were maintaining strong combat air patrol coverage continuously. They were launching massive strikes with 50 to 80 aircraft per carrier. They were recovering damaged aircraft, performing repairs, and launching them again within hours. Everything Japanese doctrine said was impossible. American carriers were demonstrating routinely. The explanation lay in different design priorities and different operational approaches. American carriers accepted reduced passive protection through open hangar designs and minimal armor to save weight for aircraft capacity. Japanese carriers prioritized protection through closed hangars and armored flight decks, accepting reduced aircraft capacity as the cost of improved survivability. American carriers used 3 elevators positioned for maximum aircraft flow, enabling rapid movement of large numbers of aircraft between hangar and flight deck. Japanese carriers used 2 elevators, which created bottlenecks during maximum effort operations, but simplified design and reduced mechanical complexity. American carriers carried massive fuel and ordnance reserves, enabling sustained operations at the cost of increased vulnerability to magazine detonations or fuel fires. Japanese carriers carried moderate reserves sufficient for planned operations, prioritizing damage control over endurance. American carriers embarked large crews with high specialization, enabling parallel operations and continuous maintenance. Japanese carriers embarked smaller crews with multi-role training, accepting lower operational tempo in exchange for reduced personnel requirements. Every design decision reflected different assumptions about how carriers would be used and what industrial support would be available. Japanese carriers were designed for decisive battle, where a single engagement would determine campaign outcomes. They needed to survive that engagement, launch devastating strikes, and return to port for replenishment. American carriers were designed for sustained operations, where campaigns would be decided by cumulative attrition over weeks or months. They needed to maintain high sortie rates continuously, absorb losses through replacement aircraft and pilots from the industrial pipeline, and operate far from bases for extended periods. The design philosophies were both rational within their contexts. But the Pacific War validated the American approach. Decisive battles did not determine the war. Sustained operations did. The carrier that could operate 100 aircraft for 3 weeks straight provided more combat value than the carrier that could operate 70 aircraft for a single decisive strike before requiring replenishment. American industrial capacity enabled the sustained operations model. Replacement aircraft arrived by escort carrier. Replacement pilots arrived by transport. Fuel and ordnance arrived by fleet oilers and ammunition ships. The entire American logistical system was designed to keep carriers operating continuously at maximum tempo for months at a time. Japan lacked equivalent logistical support. Replacement aircraft were scarce. Replacement pilots were even scarcer. Fuel and ordnance stocks were limited by merchant shipping losses and industrial bottlenecks. Japanese carriers that survived combat engagements often sat in port for weeks waiting for replacement aircraft or trained pilots to rebuild their air groups. The Zuikaku survived the Battle of the Philippine Sea, but did not return to combat effectiveness for 2 months because replacement pilots and aircraft were unavailable. An American carrier damaged in the same battle would have been back in action within 2 weeks, with replacement air group embarked from the pilot training pipeline. The cumulative advantage was overwhelming. By September 1944, American carrier task forces were operating with routine impunity throughout the Western Pacific. Task Force 38 under Admiral William Halsey conducted strikes against the Philippines with 12 carriers embarking over 1,000 aircraft. Japanese air defenses were simply overwhelmed. Land-based aircraft attempting to intercept American strikes were outnumbered 3-1 or 5-1. Japanese fighters scrambling to defend airfields faced coordinated attacks by Hellcats operating in squadron and strength. The mathematical advantage was so severe that American losses to Japanese fighters became negligible. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, American carriers demonstrated the full extent of their numerical superiority. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded Japanese Center Force, a powerful surface group built around battleships Yamato and Musashi with heavy cruiser support. Kurita's mission was to penetrate Leyte Gulf and destroy American amphibious forces supporting the Philippines invasion. On October 24th, Kurita's force transited the Sibuyan Sea, approaching Leyte Gulf from the west. American carrier aircraft from Task Group 38.2 located the force at 0810 hours. What followed was systematic destruction through overwhelming air power. First strike launched at 0926 hours. 24 dive bombers, 12 torpedo bombers, 21 fighters from carriers Intrepid and Cabot. They attacked Musashi with coordinated precision. 10 torpedo hits, 5 bomb hits. Musashi's speed reduced to 22 knots. Second strike launched at 1,230 hours. 24 dive bombers, 12 torpedo bombers from Enterprise and Franklin. They focused on Musashi. 8 more torpedo hits, 4 more bomb hits. Musashi's speed reduced to 12 knots. Third strike launched at 1,330 hours. 65 aircraft from multiple carriers. Musashi absorbed another 8 torpedo hits and 12 bomb hits. Her steering jammed. Her main battery was inoperable. Massive flooding threatened to capsize the ship. Fourth strike launched at 1,515 hours. 75 aircraft hit the crippled battleship with an additional 11 torpedo hits and 6 bomb hits. By 15:35 hours, Musashi had absorbed at least 37 torpedo hits and 27 bomb hits. She capsized and sank at 1,935 hours, taking over 1,000 men with her. The scale of the attack was unprecedented. Over 250 aircraft sorties against a single target over 9 hours. No ship could withstand that level of sustained attack. But the significant factor was that American carriers could generate 250 sorties while maintaining combat air patrol over their own task forces, launching strikes against other Japanese forces and still retaining substantial reserves. 4 carriers had launched the strikes against Musashi, while 8 other carriers from Task Force 38 operated elsewhere. Japanese forces attempting to coordinate responses faced American carriers everywhere. The numerical superiority was so complete that American carriers could simultaneously attack multiple Japanese forces hundreds of miles apart while defending themselves and supporting amphibious operations. The operational flexibility provided by 12 carriers, each embarking 100 aircraft, was something Japanese forces could not counter. Admiral Ozawa, commanding Japanese carrier forces during Leyte Gulf, understood he was leading a doomed force. His 4 carriers, Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, embarked a total of 116 aircraft. Most pilots were inadequately trained. Many aircraft were obsolescent. Ozawa's mission was to serve as a decoy, drawing American carriers north away from Leyte Gulf to enable Kurita's surface force to attack the invasion beaches. The plan required Ozawa to sacrifice his carriers. He sailed north, deliberately exposing his force to American reconnaissance. On October 25th, American carrier aircraft from Task Force 38 attacked Ozawa's force with overwhelming strength. Over 500 aircraft sorties were launched throughout the day. All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. Zuikaku, the last survivor of the 6 carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor, went down at 1,414 hours after absorbing 7 torpedo hits and 9 bomb hits. The final toll for Japanese carriers at Leyte Gulf was total. 4 carriers sunk, 0 American carriers lost. The exchange ratio reflected more than tactical proficiency. It reflected industrial capacity, translated into combat power through carrier aircraft capacity. American carriers, with 100 aircraft each, could generate sortie rates that Japanese carriers with 70 aircraft each could not match. American task forces with 12 carriers could maintain operational tempo across multiple simultaneous engagements that Japanese forces with 4 carriers could not sustain. By late 1944, the disparity in carrier capabilities had become so severe that Japanese naval aviation effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Surviving carriers lacked aircraft, training programs lacked fuel, combat squadrons lacked experienced pilots. The kamikaze tactics adopted in October 1944 reflected desperate recognition that conventional carrier operations were no longer viable against American numerical superiority. If Japanese pilots could not survive long enough to attack American ships through conventional means, perhaps suicide attacks would enable at least some pilots to reach targets before being shot down. The shift to kamikaze represented abandonment of the carrier doctrine Japan had pioneered. Carrier aviation was supposed to enable precision strikes by trained professionals flying sophisticated aircraft. Kamikaze converted pilots into guided munitions, disposable weapons expended in single-use attacks. The transition from professional carrier aviation to suicide tactics measured how completely American industrial and technological superiority had shattered Japanese naval power. The revelation that Essex-class carriers operated 100 aircraft came too late to affect Japanese strategic planning. By the time Japanese intelligence confirmed the numbers and operational commanders accepted the reality, Japan had no capacity to respond. Building larger carriers with greater aircraft capacity would require years Japan did not have. Training more pilots to crew additional aircraft would require fuel Japan did not possess. Increasing aircraft production to fill larger air groups would require industrial capacity already overwhelmed by existing demands. The Essex-class carrier aircraft capacity advantage was not a tactical surprise that could be countered through doctrinal adaptation. It was a strategic reality that reflected American industrial superiority, applied systematically across every aspect of carrier design, construction, and operation. Japan had entered the war with qualitative superiority in carrier aviation. Better pilots, better operational doctrine, better tactical coordination. These advantages eroded through attrition. Experienced pilots were killed. Sophisticated doctrine became irrelevant when you lacked aircraft to execute it. Tactical coordination proved meaningless when enemy numerical superiority was so complete that even perfect execution could not overcome it. American carriers with their 100 aircraft air groups represented quantity becoming quality. The sheer number of available aircraft enabled American forces to absorb losses, maintain continuous operations, experiment with tactics, and develop pilot experience through sustained combat exposure. Japanese forces, with their smaller air groups, had no margin for error. Every loss was critical. Every pilot killed was irreplaceable in meaningful timeframes. Every aircraft destroyed strained an industrial system already operating beyond sustainable capacity. The compounding effects of numerical superiority manifested across every dimension of naval warfare. Defense was stronger because more fighters could be maintained on combat air patrol. Offense was stronger because larger strikes could overwhelm point defenses. Reconnaissance was more comprehensive because more aircraft could be allocated to search missions. Anti-submarine operations were more effective because carriers could assign dedicated hunter-killer groups without compromising other missions. Every tactical advantage flowed from the fundamental design decision to pack 100 aircraft into Essex-class carriers instead of accepting the 70 aircraft capacity that Japanese carriers achieved. That 30 aircraft difference per carrier, multiplied across 12 or 15 carriers in a task force, created an aggregate advantage of 360 to 450 additional aircraft. That represented an entire additional carrier air group in excess of Japanese task force strength at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The strategic implications were profound. American carrier forces could operate independently with confidence that their numerical superiority provided sufficient defense against any Japanese attack. Japanese carrier forces could only operate under land-based air cover because their numerical inferiority meant they could not defend themselves against American carrier strikes. The tables had completely reversed from 1942, when Japanese carriers roamed the Pacific with confidence in their qualitative superiority. Admiral Nimitz, commanding Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, understood the mathematics of carrier warfare perhaps better than any other American admiral. His operational plans throughout late 1944 and early 1945 exploited American carrier numerical superiority systematically. He kept 3 or 4 carrier task groups operating simultaneously at different locations across the Pacific. Each task group contained 3 to 5 carriers with 300 to 500 aircraft. Japanese forces attempting to respond to American operations faced impossible decisions. Concentrating forces to oppose one American task group left other areas undefended. Dispersing forces to defend multiple areas meant each defensive concentration was too weak to oppose American carrier strength. The strategic paralysis was absolute. American carriers could strike anywhere with confidence. Japanese forces could defend nowhere effectively. The campaign against Japan itself in the summer of 1945 demonstrated the ultimate expression of American carrier superiority. Task Force 38 operated off the Japanese coast with 16 fleet carriers and numerous light carriers, embarking over 1,500 aircraft. These forces struck Japanese industry, ports, airfields, and naval installations with impunity. Japanese air defenses were overwhelmed. Fighter units assigned to defend the homeland were outnumbered 10 to 1 or 20 to 1 by American carrier aircraft. The few Japanese fighters that managed to intercept American strikes were overwhelmed by escorts. Kamikaze units attempting to attack American carriers faced fighter defenses so dense that reaching attack range required penetrating multiple layers of combat air patrol, each layer with dozens of Hellcats directed by radar to optimal intercept positions. The statistical reality was that Japanese aircraft had approximately a 5% chance of reaching American carriers through the defensive fighter screen. Those that broke through faced anti-aircraft fire from screening ships and the carriers themselves, further reducing survival probability. The overall success rate for kamikaze attacks against American carriers was less than 2%. That meant 98 of every 100 kamikaze pilots died without achieving hits. The mathematics of attrition were brutal and unyielding. The war ended in August 1945, with American carrier forces positioned to continue operations indefinitely. Task Force 38 had sufficient fuel, ordnance, and replacement aircraft to maintain maximum tempo operations for weeks without requiring replenishment. Japanese defenses had collapsed to the point where American carriers faced minimal opposition. The contrast with Japanese carrier forces was absolute. Japan had no operational carriers. The few carriers that survived the war were in port, unable to operate because they lacked aircraft, pilots, fuel, or all three. The last Japanese carrier casualty was Amagi, bombed by American carrier aircraft while in port at Kure in July 1945. She capsized and sank at her berth. The symmetry was complete. The war that began with Japanese carriers attacking Pearl Harbor ended with American carriers destroying Japanese carriers in their home ports. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.